The glitz, the glamour, jazz nightclubs, dressed to impress. Hollywood reached its golden age and lived the excesses like no other decade. It wasn't just Hollywood, but most of America, or at least in the cities. Life was lived in the extreme. Welcome to the Roaring Twenties. Prohibition of alcohol in the U.S. began in 1920 and was repealed in 1933. Yet drinking alcohol became a national obsession. People would flock to speakeasies, places which served alcohol illegally. Some estimates have the number of speakeasies at hundreds of thousands in the 1920s. Life was about going out, having a good time. Fashion defined the era. Women in strappy heels, corsets were gone. The flapper dress became a thing with drop waistlines, fitted loosely, shortened to around the knees, arms were left exposed. And fashions, such as Coco Chanel's little black dress, emerged. The tuxedo suit for men became common. Want to really impress? Show up in a white tux, as they were much more expensive. Life was lived most extravagantly in the jazz clubs. Want to be seen? This is where it was done. The Charleston dance was all the rage of the time. It was a time between the great wars, the aftermath of World War I, and the Spanish flu. The first radio station was KDKA in Pittsburgh in 1920. By the end of the decade, the majority of American families owned radios and cars for the very first time. Americans spent more time at movie theaters than any time in the decades before. The decade began with viewers flocking to silent films. In 1927, Jazz Singer was the first film with the sound of an actor's voice, or a talkie, as it was affectionately known. By 1930, all films were in this format. For the first time, electricity and phones in one's home were common. The U.S., after a victory in World War I, became a global power. The American writer Gertrude Stein coined the term lost generation in the aftermath of World War I. She moved to Paris and began having artists such as the famed Henri Matisse and Pablo Picasso often over to her house. This would quickly grow to include a number of American writers such as Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, John Dos Passos, E. E. Cummins, Archibald MacLeish, Hart Crane, Ezra Pound, and Sinclair Lewis. Paris was a creative world center for writers, performers, actors, and artists of many kinds. Creative African Americans also made their way, as they were treated far better in Paris than at home in the U.S. The American writers would hang out at Gertrude Stein's house once a week. Most of their time was spent in various cafes and their unofficial headquarters, Shakespeare and Company, an American-owned bookstore. Irish writer James Joyce would often join the Americans here. The group drank heavily. The lost generation writers had endured the tremendous loss of life in World War I. They then were confused as to the direction of life. They strongly questioned the American values, were strongly discontent, questioned why. Life's purpose, a hopelessness prevailed. Their writings were similar in the 1920s, and they wrote of American greed, materialism, and their lack of confidence in progress. This extended to different writing styles. These writers had Americans born 1883 to 1900 and also asking why. Then not just these writers would become known as the lost generation, but the actual generation itself of those born 1883 to 1900. In 1918, 675,000 died of the Spanish flu in the United States. COVID has killed 1.1 million Americans. The difference is the Spanish flu attacked the very young and healthy people under 40. COVID was more or less the opposite. This was just after 117,000 Americans were killed in World War I. The Roaring Twenties was a recovery, an urban phenomenon. The U.S. in that decade, for the first time, had over 50% of its population living in cities. It was not a good decade for rural or agricultural areas. The U.S. still had 60% of its population living in poverty, but for the rest, the Roaring Twenties were a celebration of excess. This was a rebellion against the Victorian age and Prohibition. Women wore their hair in a bop, which is a hairstyle hanging down only to the top of their neck. They were known as flappers and would dress in styles much opposed to the conservative dress of women in the decades before. Those of the Roaring Twenties were materialist and also rebelled against the conservative spending habits of the generation before. It was a time for those who prospered to have extravagant taste and live each moment as greatly as they could. There was a wild, uninhibited spirit. They drank a lot in one another's homes, often having parties. There was also a strong movement in the opposite direction that was about conservatism. Immigrants fled to America by the millions for cheap jobs. The abuse in these jobs led to general strikes and violence in the early 1920s. The corporations would violently react. Hitmen were hired. Massacres of protesting workers happened. And many other corporations would, through violence, try to prevent the organization of their workers. The result was an escalation of violence from the strikers. A Red Scare then developed. This was a growing hatred of foreigners, as they were typically the demonstrators. Conservative actions, in other ways, also developed or gained strength, such as the KKK, which became much stronger in this period. They controlled legislation in a few states and governor elections in many others. The KKK was focused on hatred for African Americans, Catholics, Jews, and foreigners as well. The Harlem Renaissance was an African American movement in Upper Manhattan part of New York City. Generally, this is considered to be from after World War I, or about 1918, and lasted at least a decade. Between 1910 and 1940, 1.6 million African Americans left the South for northern cities. Harlem was one of their main destinations. They left the South for numerous reasons, including the continuance of lynching, as there were at least a few thousand lynchings, and some believe far more. An anti-lynching bill was defeated in the Senate in 1922. Lynching was a vigilante act in which African Americans were often hanged based on accusation and without trial. There was also a lack of economic opportunity in the South, and Jim Crow laws continued. These were separate laws for whites and blacks. The Harlem Renaissance was a desire and creation of a new image of African Americans for the world. They largely paid attention to fashion, dressing as high white society did, but with their own flair. An artistry, countercultural movement developed to express their own art, music, and literature, instead of being influenced by white American culture. They looked more to their African roots for inspiration. The decade leading up to the 1920s had seen the development of the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and the New Negro Movement emerged, which would blossom in the Harlem Renaissance. New Negro, published in 1925, was an anthology edited, compiled by Elaine Locke. This was a 400-page collection of various important poems and fictional multiple writer works of the Harlem Renaissance. Elaine was the first African American Rhodes Scholar. This is one of the most prestigious academic scholarships in the world. It is a graduate scholarship to study at Oxford, one of the great universities in the world. Musicians, artists, writers, and philosophers out of Harlem became known worldwide, such as in jazz, names like Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Cab Calloway, writers like Langston Hughes, African American leaders, W.E. Du Bois, Stephen Harvey, Dancers like Bojangles. The Roaring Twenties would all come crashing down on Black Thursday in 1929. The stock market would free fall, and shortly after the Depression began, and would last for 10 years. Please subscribe and like, as that is how YouTube decides to send it on to others or not. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day, and see you in the next episode.